How was Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl who couldn't read, had never been to war, and whose entire education came from her mother teaching her prayers, how was she a genuinely effective military commander? Not inspirational figurehead, not lucky, an actual, tactical, decision-making military leader. In 13 recorded engagements, her forces won 9. At least 30 towns and cities surrendered to her without a single shot fired. She walked into rooms full of trained generals, men who had been fighting wars since before she was born, and they listened to her. So what was actually going on? Because the standard answer, she was divinely inspired, doesn't really explain how she pulled it off on the battlefield. And the cynical answer, she was just a figurehead and the real generals did everything, doesn't hold up to the historical record either. The real answer is genuinely fascinating, and it tells us something surprising about what military leadership actually is and what it isn't. Let's start with the basics, because the gap between where Joan came from and what she achieved is kind of staggering. She was born around 1412 in a small village called Domremy in northeastern France, right on the border between French and Burgundian territory. Her father was a farmer who also did minor administrative work for the village. Her mother taught her domestic tasks and prayers. That was essentially her education. She couldn't read, she couldn't write, or at least not well enough to compose anything, because she dictated all her letters to a scribe. Her world was spinning, sewing, church, and farming. But here's the first thing worth noting. Her village wasn't exactly peaceful. Domremy sat in contested territory, and raids happened. Her village was burned at least once during her childhood. Joan grew up in a place where war wasn't an abstraction. It was something that happened to real people she knew. She understood, at a basic human level, what was at stake in the conflict around her. Then, at around 12 or 13 years old, something happened that would change everything. She began hearing voices. She described them as the voices of Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. At first, they told her simple things: be devout, go to church. But over the next few years, the voices grew more insistent, and the message became specific. Go to France, find the Dauphin, the uncrowned heir to the French throne, and help him reclaim his kingdom from the English. Now, you can interpret those voices however you like. What matters for our purposes is what Joan did with them. At 16, she talked her way into a meeting with the local garrison commander, a man named Robert de Baudricourt, and asked him to give her a military escort to the royal court. He turned her away twice. She came back a third time, and this time he said yes. She traveled through hostile, enemy-held territory in disguise, arrived at court, and somehow secured a private audience with Charles VII himself. He tested her, his theologians tested her, and eventually, the French crown gave a teenage, illiterate peasant girl an army. That decision alone is worth pausing on. These were not naive people. Charles VII was a king who had been fighting for his throne for years. His advisors were experienced, educated men. They didn't just hand armies to random people who walked in claiming divine instruction. Something about Joan convinced them she was worth the risk, and what followed proved they weren't wrong. Here's where we need to push back on an assumption the original question contains: the idea that being illiterate meant Joan was somehow mentally cut off from military knowledge. In medieval Europe, the transmission of practical knowledge almost never happened through books. It happened through conversation, through watching, through listening to people who knew things. Joan grew up surrounded by adults who talked about the war constantly, because the war was their lived reality. She heard stories, she asked questions, she absorbed information the same way most people in that era absorbed information, orally. And here's something historians have noted that's easy to overlook. By the time Joan arrived at court, she had already spent weeks traveling with soldiers. The journey to Chinon, the royal court, took 11 days. She spent that entire journey riding alongside experienced military men, talking to them, learning from them. Then, before she was ever allowed near a battlefield, she was sent to Poitiers for a theological examination that lasted weeks. During this time, she was surrounded by the educated and powerful. She listened, she questioned, she absorbed. One historian described her as possessing an innate genius, the same kind of rapid, intuitive learning that lets some people master skills far faster than their formal training would suggest. Like a chess prodigy who's never read a chess book but sees patterns naturally. Joan had that quality applied to leadership and strategy. She couldn't read battlefield manuals, but she could read rooms. She could read people. She could read a situation and respond to it faster than trained commanders around her. And that, it turns out, is most of what military leadership actually requires. Let's be specific here, because the details matter. The first major test was the Siege of Orléans in 1429. Orléans had been under English siege for months. It was one of the most strategically important cities in France, and the English were slowly strangling it. The French had been trying to break the siege and failing. Joan arrived with troops, supplies, and a very different approach to the battle. First thing she did, before engaging a single enemy soldier, she spent an entire day riding around the city on horseback, personally surveying the English positions. She was doing what any competent commander should do, gathering her own intelligence rather than relying entirely on second-hand reports. Then she did something the French hadn't been doing. She went on offense. The French tactical approach at this point in the 100 Years' War had become almost pathologically passive. They'd been beaten so many times that defensive positioning had become their default. Joan rejected that completely. She was aggressive. She pushed for attack when her commanders were hesitant. She understood, instinctively, without a military education, that a besieged city doesn't get relieved by waiting. You have to break something. She also understood artillery. This is one of the most overlooked parts of her record. Historians have noted that she consistently used cannon effectively, always ensuring her forces had superior firepower before engaging. At Orléans, the city already had 70-plus guns. Joan brought more. She understood that battles aren't just about bravery, they're about positioning and resources. She was also physically present in battle in a way that mattered psychologically. She carried her battle standard, her banner, rather than a weapon, which meant she was always visible to her troops rather than buried in the fighting. When soldiers could see the banner, they knew where Joan was, and they fought differently when they could see her. She was wounded at Orléans. An arrow hit her near the shoulder and was carried off the field. She came back. That moment became legend, and legends have tactical value. Soldiers who believe their leader is fearless fight differently than soldiers who don't. From May through September 1429, Joan did not lose a single battle. Not one. Historians have noted something interesting about her only real losses. They happened consistently when she lacked sufficient artillery. Her strategic pattern was that clear. She understood her winning conditions and she pursued them. That's not luck. That's military thinking. Here's the part that gets overlooked the most. Joan's greatest military contribution might not have been tactical at all. Before Joan arrived, the French army had lost, over and over again, for decades. Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. These were catastrophic defeats that had embedded a kind of collective learned helplessness into the French military identity. The English longbow had broken them psychologically as much as physically. Joan walked into that army and somehow broke the losing streak's grip on their minds. One historian put it this way: she made an army of habitual losers believe in themselves as winners. And once they started winning, the belief and the victory became mutually reinforcing. The first win made the second win more believable. The second win made the third win feel inevitable. This is something modern military psychology has a name for: morale as a force multiplier. An army that believes it will win fights more aggressively, retreats more slowly, and makes better decisions under pressure. Joan essentially performed a psychological reset on the entire French military, and the English knew it. There's documented evidence that English commanders were genuinely unnerved by Joan, not just because she kept winning, but because her presence changed how the French fought. The French soldiers who had been passive and hesitant for years were suddenly rushing fortifications. That psychological shift had real tactical consequences. Her reputation also worked as a weapon before battles even began. Those 30-plus towns that surrendered without fighting when she approached, they weren't surrendering to an army. They were surrendering to the idea of Joan, to the fear that something unstoppable was coming. That's a form of strategic leverage that no military education teaches you. It comes from who you are and how you carry yourself. So, how was she so good? The honest answer is that Joan's lack of formal education didn't strip her of the things that military leadership actually runs on. It stripped her of book knowledge she wasn't going to need anyway. What she had instead was a set of qualities that formal military training often fails to produce. She was an extraordinarily fast learner in practical, real-world settings. She gathered her own intelligence rather than trusting reports. She was aggressive when aggression was called for, and patient when patience was the winning move, as at Orléans, where she and her experienced co-commander waited out the English rather than charging their longbow formation. She understood her own winning conditions, superior firepower, and she pursued them consistently. She led from the front in a way that transformed the morale of the army around her. And she was, by any measure, one of the most psychologically effective leaders of the medieval period. The question, how could she be a good leader without education, assumes that military leadership lives in books. It doesn't. It lives in judgment, in the ability to read people and situations, in the willingness to act under uncertainty, and in the capacity to make others believe. Joan of Arc had all of those things in extraordinary measure. The voices she heard told her she was meant to save France. Whether or not you believe that, what's undeniable is that she built the skills, made the decisions, and fought the battles herself. Education didn't give her those abilities, and the lack of it didn't take them away. She was 19 years old when they burned her at the stake. She had already changed the course of a war.